Hello. Welcome to the Commons. My name's Christy. I'm the Assistant Curator of Public Programs here at the MCA. Today we are delighted to have Michael Darling speaking with Enrico David, whose exhibition has just opened over there, you might have seen. So thanks all for joining us. I'll give it to Michael to take it away.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's a treat to have Enrico here, of course. And I think it's safe to say we're both really happy with how the exhibition turned out. It's been a long time in the planning, both this exhibition, which I bet we've been talking about for at least 2 years or something like that. We also have some other partners in the exhibition, too. The Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. has been involved from the beginning, so the show will eventually travel there next year, which is really exciting. And I'd also say that, you know, our relationship goes back quite a long ways, maybe 10 years or something like that. I think it's fun to just even consider that we're in a art fair weekend right now here, and I think that's where we first met. I mean, I know I first saw your work at Frieze Art Fair in London, and I think your dealer at the time said, well, would you like to meet Enrico? And I said, sure. And so I think we had a little coffee at the Frieze Art Fair, 10 or 12 years ago or something like that. So even these little chase encounters at a crazy venue like an art fair can lead to something, very lasting, which is nice to think about. So this exhibition is the first show where a large body of Enrico's work across many years. In fact, there's almost 20 years of work here have been pulled together. It's something that I've always wanted to see, and I've always wanted other people to be able to see because I've loved your work so much, Enrico. But maybe could we start for those in the crowd that don't know your work so well, could we do a little bit of a walk down memory lane and talk a little bit about your history and your history, kind of Italy to London, and then we can jump off from there.
Hello. Hi. My voice is I've got a bit of a sore throat, so I will try to modulate myself and be clear. But I was born in Italy in 1966, and I moved to London when I was 20 in 1986, with no intention to or no clear idea about what was going to be that I wanted to do in London. But there was always an artistic pursuit and interest in cultural things, and London was the place that, in my mind, was the closest to a sort of liberating, open, inspired environment that from Italy seemed to be quite easy to reach and accessible. And of course, it was very hard in the beginning. I couldn't speak any English at all, and so there was this sort of very long training, sort of life training process. And then art school happened via very sort of unlikely circumstances of talking to people, telling me that I should have tried to apply for a foundation course, but it was all incredibly unplanned, and there was no real system of also like today, sort of looking up things on the internet or checking out courses online, and it was so analog, and sort of you had to book a flight like 3 months in advance if you wanted to fly from London to Rome, or so it was very sort of strange and hardware, and so that was graduated in the mid-90s, and I sort of I continued making the work that I felt was progressively logical to make, and trying to use the circumstances that I had that were very limited. And I think the reason why a lot of my work, and it still is very much in a sort of realm of domestication, is because I often found myself working from home, not being able to maybe afford studio spaces, and so there was very much a dynamic of domesticity about the way that I was thinking about making work. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, but speaking about that domesticity for a minute, you come from a family of makers and creative people, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But also, did you know from a young age that you had this urge to also express yourself visually or with your hands in that way?
Well, I don't think I had a conscious sort of direction as to what it is that I was going to do, but there was definitely an environment around my upbringing that was very uninhibited in terms of using things and touching things and making things, and so there was always stuff around. My father had this very large workshop, sort of studio place that was producing furnitures, and so there was a sense of like, my mother was a dressmaker who wasn't really working as a dressmaker, but she was making maybe clothes for us or from time to time or for herself. But so there was totally an uninhibited relationship to things, to materials, and there was a lot of stuff around. And then my sister and my brother ended up opening up a second-hand shop, but that became my sister developed like a specialization in restoring textiles, and my brother became a leather craftsman. So this sort of craftsmanship of, whatever we associate also with Italian handmade things was also happening in a very small scale in my everyday domestic life in a small town in Italy. So I guess a lot of the solutions that I found in my work were indirectly coming from misusing the sort of more orthodox ways that all my family members were using those things to make the things that they were making. And so I tampered with their techniques in a way. And yeah.
I think it's important, and especially because as folks, if you're seeing the slides up here, or if you've gone through the show, there is such a wide variety of materials and approaches and techniques in the exhibition. And I think you and I tried to emphasize that in a way and try to have as many diverse approaches as possible. But I think to me that's also one of the things that's helped to propel your work forward. You'll introduce a new way of working, whether it's tapestries, or I just saw in your show in New York right now some felted pieces, and oftentimes maybe some of the imagery, some of the concerns might be consistent or similar, but then once a new material is introduced, it takes on a totally different feeling. Is that something that you consciously think about as you're trying to keep moving and challenging yourself?
I don't think that there is a conscious research in terms of how the work has to develop. I mean, whatever direction the work takes is always based on something that seems the result of the actual mechanics of what I'm looking at in terms of a drawing, and to pursue a kind of a curiosity about how could I make something out of something, and that translation makes the magic of the poetry is often in that translation into those things that maybe are not meant to be executed in certain ways, but in other ways. And but I don't have a plan in terms of kind of prepared idea about what sort of material thing my next work should be made out of. I mean, it's incredibly intuitive, and sometimes I collaborate with my friend in London, Matthew, who is a felt maker, and having spent years looking at the things that he made, I thought it would be interesting to translate something into that. So he taught me how to make this material, this felt, to making felt from scratch. But I think that there is a sense of restlessness in the way that the work sort of pursue a destination from one source to another, and I don't want to interfere with it in a way. So I want to allow the work maybe to also end up in some sort of unlikely or less successful translations, but that should not, it should not be stopped in a way. I mean, it's still worth the effort in my views.
And those surprises that happen when you see something turn out in a way that you couldn't control, couldn't predict. I mean, it feels like your work is guided a lot by those kinds of things.
Yes, yes. And also I think it's about somehow dispersing I don't want the work to maintain a sense of, I don't want to trust that the way that, a body of work can be built out of one material is the way that the work will always have to be made. So there is almost like an element of disruption to the cycle of the work, and not trying to turn the work into a currency that is so identifiable with. And so to introduce different voices within the work. And I think the fact that the work is primarily figurative perhaps allows me for then exploring these other ways of expressing that figuration through all these other things. So the subject matter seems to be pretty much always the same, but then there is this sort of idea of maybe the material introduces new elements, and in the way that the material is treated, introduces new elements and new forms of maybe languages or new forms of expression.
Is that something that's ever been kind of held against you, like where people, say, "Oh, your work is so inconsistent," or kind of having some sort of strange sense that things should be more consistent from piece to piece? Or I mean, I guess it's a question about like professionally, has that kept you back, or have you? Because it's for me, it's the thing that I'm most attracted to. This again, this variety and this, as you said, restless kind of questing. But
no, I don't think so. I don't feel that there is a strong. I mean, obviously, I produce work in a very domesticated way, so I don't have huge production line of work, so that everything happens quite slowly, and it's got very sort of careful execution time. So I cannot churn out this stuff like with a line of assistants making things like, which is a methodology that many artists use, and, that's great if it works for them, but I'm just sort of more interested in the actual perils of making these things kind of very cared for in their own world and following them through as much as possible in their sort of final sort of result. And so there is a sort of a slowness, maybe. It's almost like the slow food dimension to the production of this work. I don't know. But I think it's quite important to maintain that relationship with it, for me, personally.
It seems like one of the things that I've always been fascinated about in your work is that it feels incredibly personal, like there must be psychological states of yours that you're working through in the work, or maybe biographical stories, things from your childhood, things from memories, even things from dreams sometimes. And yet the work still has a sort of universal quality where I think other people that don't even know those backstories or motivations that you might have can come to the work and kind of see themselves reflected in it in some way. How do you navigate that, or do you ever find yourself in a spot where you're making something that's too personal and obscure and that you don't think might translate to a public?
I don't feel like it. At the moment, I'm actually feeling quite distant from any sort of personal narrative that the work has. I think I have had moments when I've been quite interested in maybe investigating certain sort of maybe biographical things just as a starting point. But I really have observed the work taking a much more neutral and that's actually very narrative-free dimension. I think most of the narrative happens in the handling of the materials. I mean, and I'm trying to actually really be conscious of the way that that is a primary subject of the work, is the way that the work is made, is the compositional elements of the work. So there's no story anymore. I mean, not story that should interact or be of interest to the interpretation of the work. This beyond the sort of biographical notes that one might be interested in, but I don't think that you would find a evocation of a certain anecdote in my life connected to the work. It has happened in the past, in certain moments, but it's definitely right now not something that is close to me as a strategy to make work. There's no strategy beyond the material sort of handling. Yeah.
Another thing that I find very striking about your work is it seems like you have really broad interests in material culture. Like, I mean, it feels like you're looking at things from all kinds of different periods, all kinds of different cultures, and I don't think that's always the case with other artists that might have a real focus on one particular time period or a particular type of artist. And it seems like all of those different interests, I mean, from things that are quite ancient, things that must tap into your Italian upbringing, things that you're seeing in the milieu of London, that they all kind of get mixed and collaged and remixed in different ways. Do you feel like you have a broader tastes or interests than your peers, or sense that in your work?
Hello. Sorry. I don't think so. I don't think that every artist follows a certain sort of personal mythology in a way, and a certain thread of influences and things. I mean, I don't feel that mine is particularly. I mean, I'm actually more conscious of how little research I do these days compared to a lot of artists who I know personally, who actually spend a lot of time researching for their work. I mean, I don't do any research. There's it's kind of stuff that belongs to some sort of imaginary archive, and I use, very much as a train of thoughts that come from maybe the previous. I'm just really trying to look at my own work primarily these days, and I make work that is based on the previous works that I've made, or the drawings that I'm looking at, or so there's a sense of like it's a very self-fed and quite selfish, and isolated. But that's not to say that in the making of the work, then I don't make actually use of things that are parts of my vocabulary, or things that have been somehow even not necessarily particularly liked by, they're not even in my taste range, or things that I don't necessarily like. I mean, liking things is sometimes a little bit like an interference to the actual mechanics of the work. How the work can be, should not have really a sense of personal taste. That comes after, maybe. Sometimes I do like what I do very much, but it's more about the surprise. And I think making sculpture in particular has got like a real sense of surprise. I think that making things is very much about that surprise. And you can only witness it when you have pursued the making of that thing. And sometimes I recognize elements that are maybe from either literature or design or applied arts or, ancient arts. But it's definitely not about sort of quoting directly. The materials are the materials that, have been used maybe with certain, with a certain edge of margin of change, but they're pretty much universal materials. I'm not using anything. I mean, there's a show upstairs about the internet, which I think is so much more wild in terms of the way that people use things. I mean, this is like sort of old timers,
But in terms of this I like this idea that you mentioned of this imaginary archive. I mean, you're in your early 50s,
yeah.
So you've been able to build up this archive, and so you have this language that you mentioned. But when you were just starting out, was that more of a struggle, like without that same kind of reservoir of ideas and imagery and things, when you were trying to kind of find this personal language?
I actually felt that my personal interest in terms of cultural endeavors did not necessarily have to be of interference with my own personal pursuits of what was my language. I mean, directly. So there wasn't like a sense of like, because the things that I was finding interesting, that were making my life richer in terms of films or theater or whatever, or other art, etc., was always something that I felt was somehow going to be indirectly used, but never with the sense that I was kind of accumulating this information in order to then process it and make my own work. My idea of maybe, I don't know, I have a very loose relationship with the sort of inspiration of things that I find inspiring, or that I think, you know, like if I think of Picabia, or if I think of certain art that has been at some points making me look at things and thinking like, looks really possible and it looks quite simple. However, then in order to make it your own, the process is very complicated. So to just imitate or emulate the work of other people is quite simple, and it makes you feel like you're getting somewhere. But actually, the biggest leap is when you're almost like getting rid of everybody and just be by yourself and just try to see what you can come up with without any of that sort of, all those voices. So it's a process, and it's an ongoing process. And I think, you know, I'm actually strangely not so open. Not that I'm not open, but I don't look at so many things anymore. I mean, I don't really tend to look at sort of, I'm not very well informed about new art, or I don't really go to see so many exhibitions, and so I don't know. I mean, it's a very sort of, it's my relationship to these things, and I'm not sure whether it explains the way that I make things or not, but there is a sense of insularity maybe about it. Does that answer the question?
I don't know if I mean, maybe that seems like I think you're painting yourself to be a more of a hermetic figure than I know you are, because you are so cosmopolitan and so concerned about the world and politics and the state of things, and but I can see that maybe what you're saying kind of refers to perhaps just like the actual studio practice itself, maybe. Yeah,
I'm not a hermit by all stretch of the imagination. I mean, I don't work in a sort of isolated sort of, you know, bell jar or an echo chamber, you know, but I think in the course of, say, maybe 25, 30 years of thinking about making images, you know, I don't feel that my relationship to the phenomena of culture or politics that are affecting my life need to be manifested in what I make as evidence of the fact that I'm aware of things. I mean, the work is somehow, I trust the fact that, you know, if you're actually purposefully involved in making something which is truly from your heart and with love, you know, then the things that actually affect your reality are going to be in the things that you make. It might take a little bit longer to districate the actual things that you're troubled by or that you're inspired by, but they're there. But I don't want to be demonstrative of the inspirations or the things that I'm protesting against, or, you know. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. Or there's this kind of beautiful ambiguity in your work that allows kind of the real world to kind of creep in and map itself onto these things. Like now, all of a sudden now looking at, there's a piece we might see in here called Racket, Racket 2, where there's a cluster of these 4 figures that are all kind of coming out of a single base, and they're whispering in each other's ears, and it looks kind of menacing, and all. I just can't help but think of this Supreme Court nomination process of this venomous kind of relationship,
pernicious and horrible.
And so you're even though again there's this interesting thing that you do that comes from a very personal vision, but ends up becoming a strange mirror of what's going on out there that we all can kind of understand.
I mean, Gordon, with my, you know, we often talk about the things that I do at the moment are increasingly becoming like photorealist works that actually reality really looks like, you know, those that could
choking
be,
on.
Yeah, I mean, it's. But I think that there is this sort of my position. I think is very much of thinking that the space where this kind of language is born and grows is a place where you. You almost have to raise above the conversation that you feel tempted to have about certain issues. that there is a sense of the right that the work has to maintain a silence. And that silence actually opens up different languages and different conversations that may or may not hit the viewer or me, or, I'm talking about the viewer as, I'm lucky enough to have viewers, but even if it was just my gaze on it, it would just be like the surprise that the work gives you. And I don't really feel like everything else needs, we're so become accustomed to having explanations and footnotes and explanatory sort of dialogues to everything we see. Everything is so fed on us, to us in such a sort of broken down way, little morsels that we can digest easily and comprehend easily. And I think it's quite important for the place of art to maintain a sense of magic in a way, or mystery, or unclarity, or not understanding. I think my relationship with not understanding is very precious. I actually really defend my rights not to understand certain things in the sphere of what I'm doing, It doesn't matter for me to be explaining the work, or for the work to be explained to people. And I think that for a lot of other artists, there is a very important dialogue that has to take place in that way, which is direct. I assume that if you're looking at art, you are open to that too. That you're open to that sense of mystery. And you're not finding that an enemy, but you're actually finding it as a source of energy, maybe. It's actually energizing not to know something, rather than feeling that you're alienated, or is also the time of consumption, of the work, that allows the work to be slower and consumed more slowly, maybe.
You said something earlier that rang true with me about how sometimes you like to misuse certain materials or certain techniques. And in a similar fashion, as people can see, the figure is, very present in your work. And you have really abused the figure in very provocative ways, and really distorted it and tested its limits. And oftentimes, when an artist is able to do that, then maybe it's after having really, so let's say in this case, learned anatomy and things like that. Do you feel like you had some kind of a classical training that then you've now subverted,
No.
or did you study even the human figure from a more scientific perspective before you could get to these incredibly distorted visions of the figure?
No, I cannot claim that sense of exploration of the human figure coming from, my understanding of anatomical knowledge, or at all. I think it's again the result of some sort of process of adaptation. And when I sort of found myself using almost exclusively the human form, maybe coming from my background or I don't know, but it seemed like it was the simplest and the most sort of viscerally connected subject matter. I think, I understand that I ask a lot of a figure to express the complexity of human emotions, and, and so that what I end up actually doing to the human figure is something quite abominable in some cases, because it feels like it has to respond to something which is quite primal and is quite visceral and is very complicated, and I cannot really explain it in words. But so it's almost trying to think of using the figure as always with a sense of emergency, and it's like the first thing that comes to my aid is a human form, and that what happens to it has to be seen. But it's definitely not the result of a study. The study happens obviously in the course of my 20 whatever years of making work, but it is not from an anatomical or scientific study. It's more like a language adaptation, I would say, that uses the human form as a basic sort of vocabulary.
And in just another form of experimentation, where you're trying and failing and succeeding and having surprises when something turns out one way or another way. And
also because we have a sense of not really knowing what's happening to our bodies. We assume that our bodies are just perfect machines that sort of do the job every day, more or less, and but we actually know so little. I mean, none of us is, we're not all doctors. We don't all have anatomical knowledge about, like, how does your pancreas work? I don't know. It's like, but there is a sense of, like, because of that lack of knowledge, actually, it becomes a kind of a playing field of that. It almost becomes a perfect metaphor for expressing the language-body relationship and the mystery of it. So the less I know, the better, I would say. Yeah.
You also were just saying a minute ago about kind of trying, not maybe having the language to describe some of these distortions and things that you're performing, but sometimes, well, a couple of these slides here are untitled, but oftentimes you have these really amazingly provocative or evocative titles. And is that when you lean on a title like that, is that when you're trying to kind of, again, create some kind of space or explanation for this operation that you've done on these figures, or where does that come from? Because you have a real adeptness with language.
Again, it's a surprise when it happens. And I don't force titles on things, and I don't force things on potential titles. But sometimes there are these sort of imaginary lines that sort of cross between maybe misheard words or something that you read or something that is literally kind of expanding out of the work or of the image. So it's a fortuitous encounter. It's definitely not like a preconceived. I don't have a kind of a list of titles that are looking for works or the other way around. It's a real sort of coincidence. I would say, I don't know. It's like a. I think there's something like a making a spell. You just put all these things together, whether it's a mix of like a head looking for some sort of body, and then the right material, and then a word. But it's really like a sort of a strange table of elements that sort of gets all mixed up, and sometimes it comes with the perfect combination of form and words, and sometimes it just remains untitled. Yeah,
because it's pretty extreme from
sometimes
untitled to this really elaborate thing. So I would love this idea of a spell.
Yeah,
and all these that accounts for all of these different elements, and some get used and some get activated and others don't. And and that also seems very appropriate to this still kind of shamanistic or mystical kind of quality that is in your work as well.
Yeah. I think it's quite an interesting. I'm thinking about this idea of the spell more because I've been looking at some sort of future projects and stuff, and there is this real kind of the idea of thinking about making work as is sort of like drawing all these things to create this solution, and the solution is like a mix of ingredients, and then the work becomes this sort of strange concoction of things that is part your history, is part the choice of things, is part how do you imagine translating something into other languages. So there is this sort of the mystery of a language that you don't understand, and it's a codification. And spell is quite an interesting notion at the moment of thinking of these things as.
I think I might have to steal that and use that metaphor as I'm taking people through the exhibition.
I license you. It's a spell.
Is there a medium or a format that you've not had the chance to work in yet that you would really like a chance to work in, or like a certain scale
I would like to make music. That was one thing I would like to do, but I have no idea how. But I would like to make some sounds or music. Yeah, that I would quite like. Well, in terms of materials, I can't think, because everything, potentially, I could think, it's all out there, it's all kind of fairly possible. But music feels kind of quite, I've always been incredibly interested and fascinated by music. And I think I've got quite a strong musical sense, but I've never been able to play an instrument. So it's like, I'd like to sort of explore that a little bit. I don't know how to translate the idea of a drawing into music, or if the music would have to have no relationship to the visuals, you know. But yeah, that's something that I would like to.
That's not what I was expecting to say, but I like it though. But you know, I mean, you were in a band.
Maybe, you know. I mean, I could think anything is, you know. I mean, I'm looking at this show here. There's just such a kind of so many things that I think, yeah, I could think of making something like revisit certain things and thinking of them in a different material, but within the range of the lexicon of materials, everything is more or less accessible. You know what I mean? It's not like such a far-fetched. I mean, it'd be nice to design a house. That's another thing I quite like to do. But in terms of actual works, I think, you know, everything could maintain itself in the way that it is, or maybe with some variations, maybe in scale. I think the scale is fine. I don't really feel like I need to make bigger works. I mean, I've never really been sort of, I quite like this, again, these domesticated aspects of the work. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I'm sure there's some mediums that I haven't quite thought of. But yeah, build a house and make music. There's two things I would quite like. Or a house with a recording studio.
Oh yeah, because it's worth reminding everybody that you were in a band.
Oh, I was briefly in a band, yes.
In the 90s that had some success called Donateller.
Yeah.
But there you said, you were telling me the other day that you were kind of making noises, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a band that was not really like, it was an art band, so there was an artist that was the leader of the band, but in the same way, it was like more like about the group, this kind of group of people. There was like 4 or 5 of us, and but everybody was kind of more or less tone deaf. So I was used as a sort of tuning device to sort of tell them where to pitch things, and it was kind of fun, more on a social dimension than anything. I mean, I performed with them twice, and I was just on the backstage making this sort of human bass noises, you know, like sort of, it was all very sort of fun, but yeah.
Okay.
That's not the kind of music I was thinking of when I said I'd like to make music. I was more like thinking about harps, or, you know, sort of learn to play the harp, or the piano.
That'd be great. I mean, you answered the question in a much more articulate way than I asked the question too, because I guess it's really interesting to hear you say, like, you know, any material you want to use, it's in this day and age, it's at your fingertips now. So maybe early I was thinking more about scale, and even looking at the mud hippie collage, like, what if that was a gigantic thing in the middle of some square somewhere? And, but it's great to hear that that doesn't motivate you, that you like this domestic scale, which again makes so much sense because of this human one-to-one kind of relationship that your work seems to create for people. Yeah,
I think it's sufficient. I mean, it's really like asking you what is enough, you know, and I feel like, I mean, I'm looking at this amazing Thomas Schutter sculptures, you know, and I think he's like he's somebody who works in a very somehow also modest way. Even his large works have a sense of modesty and humanity. So it is possible to make things that retain a sense of intimacy even when they're large, because, you know, when you're a good artist, you can do that with great ability. But I think also, like, you know, it's the logistics of it. You know, to make something like that, you have to get involved. There's so many agencies and things, and I think I quite like the kind of the privacy of the circumstances through which I make work. You know, I kind of struggle to even think about taking my work to, say, a foundry, because I feel like I have to explain to them what it is, and they sort of look at me like, oh my God, you know, what is that? You know, it's just sort of like, it's quite stressful. So I've tried to make everything as much as I can out of everybody's eyes, you know, and then I bring it into an exhibition if I'm lucky enough to do so. But the idea of like a collective, and that's why music, bands also, is quite, I find that kind of not really my medium or my, you know, ideal vehicle. There is a sense of solitude that I treasure about making work. And when you do things like that, it becomes kind of quite an endeavor. I mean, it looks like nothing, but actually there's a huge amount of work behind something like that.
Bureaucracy.
And bureaucracy and materials and the, you know, the kind of the logistics, and it's like crazy, yeah. can barely manage something like that, you know, so sort of like my height, no more. Yeah.
Before we open it up to questions, I was wondering if now, again, it's one of those situations where an artist like yourself sees all of these pieces brought back together again, many of which you haven't seen in many, many years. And, you know, we had some great moments as these things were coming out of the crates and things like that. But seeing all of this together, what are your thoughts? Or are you excited to kind of get back to the studio, or are you terrified?
I feel really lucky. I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to see these things that in my mind were always, you know, there was always a curiosity of how these two images would work together, and you know, to be invited to do something like this is incredibly fortunate and inspired, and you know, I'm very grateful. Yeah, and I feel really like, there's a lot of work to do. You know, looking at all these things, it makes me feel like, you know, it's like there's room for improvement.
Well,
I don't know how, but
I mean, you've set yourself up to be able to grow any way you want to because of this open kind of language you've developed. So that I think that's got to be.
I think also this exhibition has I think in fairness, I would say that it's a particular voice of my work, that we could have gone so many different avenues in terms of creating different configurations of things that would have actually opened up much more, maybe different kinds of perversion or different kinds of relationships with materials. But I think we kept a very sort of, I would say, as an introduction, I think is the best show we could have thought of doing. In introduction to sort of people who don't know my work, obviously. But in terms of my personal, I think seeing this work makes me think about another 4 or 5 exhibitions that I could have made in a way that have a very different emphasis on certain things. And so yeah, I'm accepting invitations from local.
Well, and I love that too. Just like getting the ball rolling, and like this, and absolutely thinking that a show like this is one particular slice through your work, but there's all kinds of other possibilities, and hope maybe bigger ones too. And so we kind of took a certain path, but I think that's another testament to the depth of your work, that this is not the definitive Enrico David show. It's there's so much more there.
Watch out.
Well, would you, Enrico, would you be up for some questions from the crowd? How would we do the, Christy? Will we pass a mic around or just have people speak up?
We're just gonna have people speak up.
Okay. Any brave souls? Yes?
Yeah, I do, yeah. Yeah, lately it's really like, I'm sort of observing my drawings as if they were like instruction manuals to assemble an IKEA library. I'm really trying to figure out how to make a thing out of that drawing. And I make a drawing without any aim to make it become anything other than what it is. But then, that's my starting point. Yeah.
Also, could you talk to us a little bit about the tapestries or the weavings?
Yeah. Well, the weavings, there's no weavings to speak of. Everything is appliqued, more or less, or embroidered. So there's different, but there's no weaving. I'm doing weaving now, but I've never really sort of made any work that was somehow aimed at, I don't know, it's still in progress. But anyway, the textile work in my life came when I was working at home, and I ended up retreating from the possibility of having a studio outside my house. So I kind of ended up working in ways that would not be so intrusive to my domestic life. And I was actually living with the person that is behind you, who is there. It was my roommate, and some nearly 25, 30 years ago now, something like that, 25 years ago. So I started messing around with some yarn on canvas, and I expanded this kind of concept of making these drawings and sort of translating them into this sort of surface coverage of things. And so I made a series of these embroideries. There's one right at the entrance, and then from there, about maybe 5, 6 years ago, I started working with this other method, which is the other tapestries that my sister showed me as a way of recycling all kind of clothes. In the north of Italy, they used to make these small sort of little textile works, and I basically expanded that into a larger format. And it came at the time when I was actually transitioning between one city. I was living in Berlin, and I was kind of moving back to London. I didn't have a studio, and it was a lot of circumstances that I had a deadline to produce work for the Venice Biennale that year, and I ended up having to find a way to produce work outside of a studio. So my sister has a workshop in my hometown, which is where we ended up beginning to produce these sort of textile works. So it was almost like an emergency sort of solution to a kind of coming up with something. And it was also like, it coincided with my mother passing away, so there was a connection between beginning the use of abstraction, which was like a totally new thing for me. So all the tapestries have this sort of very generic, banal, sort of more or less unprocessed abstract drawings that were like sort of more or less stylized into something. And so to me, they were always representing this idea of disappearance of human features. There was a link, and I couldn't quite even explain to myself nowadays why that link was there, but it was something to do with my mother's sort of death and the abstraction of these tapestries. There was a connection, and the fact that I was making them with my sister, and there was this sort of process of heavy mourning. and of course then it's almost like an ongoing thing. It's like still sort of looking into this sort of disappearance, and that's how they came to be. And then I'm now making felt. I've made these 3 felt pieces that are in this exhibition in New York. That's a new thing that it's again about. I mean, I'm fascinated by the textile sort of dimension of making images, and maybe because of a sort of an innate familiarity with it or something, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes?
Thanks for the exhibition, Enrico, which I find really, really beautiful. Also because it allowed me to see a lot of what they are seeing now, the kind of context of all together. It is the first time that I've noticed that, at least as far as I'm aware of, the 99% of your work is somehow kind of sculptural or pictorial. It's not kinetic, it doesn't move. But this very work here is the only one that moves. It moves through I imagine, an electric device, electric engine. So it's the only kinetic work where there's something that you have not made, is the engine. All the other work. So I kind of wonder whether there's something there that has troubled you, and that's why you've never then explored the kinetic side of it. Also because I've begged people several times to make it sound.
Yes.
It would require an engine. So kind of, I would like to explore whether there's something there that about your kind of making
Mhm.
and what an engine, an electrical.
I don't think that there was, I mean, the particular sculpture was, I actually exhibited the first time in LA in a static way. It was actually on the floor with no plinth, and it was sort of, and, but I felt that there was an aspect of it that felt like a prototype for something that I wanted to display as a design object. I was almost like degrading that sculpture or taking it into a realm that was somehow not necessarily connected to the display of a sculpture. Although to me it was a sculpture. So there was this sense of ambiguity and paradox and unresolved sort of conflict about what is it? What is this thing? And so then when, again, I was invited to do another Venice Biennale, that's the first time that I was there, and actually I showed that work, and I actually had this idea of really showing it as a design object. And so I went to the Vitra shop, and I asked them to lend me one of those displays where they put those chairs on, and they kindly gave me one. And I think it's more about the fountain. Strangely enough, I've now been, I'm in negotiation with the collectors in St. Louis who is actually we're looking into the realization of one sculpture as a fountain. And I think that there are certain, I'm not necessarily shying away from it, or I'm not necessarily embracing it as a, but yeah, I'm aware of the fact that I could enter a whole avenue of production or investigation or studies of things that could involve kinesis or electricity or water. But it's really like the primary source of that should always be the nature of the work. And then the work tells me whether is it necessary to do that or not. And if so, I have to be convinced that that is something that would add something beyond the actual work itself. So that I wouldn't just do it because I can do it. I would like to do it because it feels totally like a final conclusion for that image to be. Because potentially a lot of sculptures could become fountains, in a sense, you know what I mean? Like,
Yet I believe that somehow consciously or unconsciously, the fact that you haven't installed a kinesis via electricity is because it, in some way or another, I believe it troubles you.
maybe, yeah. No, it's possible. I don't know. Absolutely. Yeah.
And perhaps a water fountain that is based on kind of gravity rather than an electric
Yeah.
would somehow kind of be more authentic.
No, I don't feel that.
I don't know, it's a possibility.
But I take your point. I don't know. Yeah, I cannot answer that. But it's interesting because actually this fountain thing is very topical. It's this week's news. A fountain is coming. Or maybe.
But it's true that the piece, this one in particular, is so planar.
Yeah.
And somehow it lends itself to the sense of like stop action motion or something that, whereas none of the other pieces really would probably lend themselves to being activated in that way. So yeah,
there is a repetition about that work that is very much like, for me the fascination of it was just how I engineered these four things to stay together. And I mean, it felt such a kind of a celebration of it. To have it spinning at that speed was like, I mean, I couldn't ask for more. I was so happy to see it again. I was like, oh my God, this is so great. And it made me feel like I should make it bigger. That's one thing I thought, God, imagine that in a plaza would be quite interesting. These four guys having this sort of penetrative scene, like in a nice big, sort of in front of a bank, something like that, We need to talk to some bank guys. Pardon?
laser cut.
No, I cut it with the jigsaw. Yeah. I've done a good job. Yeah, it was a very fine blade. Yeah, I was very proud of my jigsaw skills. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Anyone? Yes.
like, how do I choose the material for?
What inspires you to choose the exact material?
Well, the white material, the jasmonite, is a material that I've only started using maybe 3 years ago, and it was really about the fact that I wanted to maintain faithfulness to the relationship to the drawing. So the white of the material and the possibility of putting graphite on it was almost taking that three-dimensional form in my mind back into a two-dimensional form as far as I could. And the jasmonite was just a sort of more stronger and more durable, well, not necessarily durable, but it's a very strong, and you can actually work that surface in a way that is so much more accurate than plaster, for instance. And bronze, white bronze, I've always found incredibly problematic. So patinated bronze in white, and the weight of it, and the process of bronze making is also incredibly more, really, you know, delegating foundries and stuff. Whereas I can actually make these in my studios, these white pieces. But it was really about the relationship with the drawings that was. But then, for instance, there is that gel piece, you know, that hanging from the ceiling that is made with this sort of rubber. And again, that was because of the quality of the lines, and the quality of that blue haze that was in the watercolor. Again, that was not making the use of jasmonite possible. So I had to somehow find another material that would somehow suit the translation best. In the same way that those cloud works that hang from the ceiling, they were like watercolors. And in order to give that sense of ethereal, sort of gassy feel, I had to sort of think of another sort of surface quality and then a different way of painting. So it's all kind of really directly connected to the quality of the image that, you know, it starts from. Like,
Do you spend any time just getting familiar with different types of materials, or do you just, as you go, do you just pick up different recommendations?
well, I work with somebody. I have an assistant who used to work for a fabrication company, and he used this, he introduced me to this rubber, for instance, that was used by, they were making prototypes for Zaha Hadid furnitures. So he had worked with that material before, and so we kind of we sort of, I said, get some, you know, let's just find what it is. And it was such an amazing, not that he took it from Zaha Hadid, but, you know, we bought our own, but it was like, it turned out to be like a really good, because it's non-toxic and it's durable and it's very resistant. And it kind of, you know, we made quite a few experiments to see the level of transparency and translucency and how these wires would be coming through. So we do have, you know, I mean, I have a kind of quite a bit of research time in terms of materials. I mean, I try things and. I have a pretty good success rate in terms of, I mean, in my mind, you know, that's not in terms of in the outside world, but I feel like I've often found good, sometimes if it doesn't quite replicate the drawing, it does something that I find equally interesting or, you know, worthy of staying in this world, you know. So the brief can be opened up a little bit. It's not so dogmatic.
Thank you, Enrico, for sharing your thoughts and your exhibition with us.